International Cooperation, Security and Strategic Languages, Lieutenant General Asif Mistry, Director, School of Internal Security, Defense and Strategic Studies, faculty, staff, students, and the audience joining us through online platform. Vipal Harish, student of Masters in International Relations and Security Studies, welcome you all to the 36th Global Confab on National Security, organized by School of International Cooperation, Security and Strategic Languages, SISL, and School of Internal Security, Defense and Strategic Studies, SISDIS. The conversations in the series revolve around issues relevant to the main focus area of the school, such as international relations and national security, political economy, and strategic languages. This lecture endeavors to bring eminent personalities, including policymakers in government and opinion influencers from the wider strategic community, to provide varied perspectives, thereby adding to the existing discourse on the subject. It will also act as a platform for students from different areas of specialization to interact with one another, thereby enabling an interdisciplinary approach into research at the university. Since October 2021, there have been 35 lectures encompassing 5 broad areas of foreign policy, economy, major powers and national security, traditional security, and non-traditional security. The prominent speakers are from diverse backgrounds, from defense and civilian bureaucracy to the media and academia, including Dr. Somanathan, Finance Secretary, Government of India, current Sri Lankan High Commissioner to India, Milinda Muragoda, General Khandare, Principal Advisor, Ministry of Defense, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, Chairman, National Security Advisory Board, Mr. Michael Kugelman, our serving ambassadors and high commissioners in Dhaka, Muscat, Tashkent, Zagreb, and Taipei. Today, the world is experiencing turbulence with challenges of major powers, US-China rivalry, disruption in supply chain, and contemporary national security threats. The global economy has been facing negative headwinds in terms of rising food and energy prices as a result of COVID-19 pandemic and Russia-Ukraine conflict. At the same time, India is on a geopolitical center stage, from G20 presidency, increasing importance in Indo-Pacific region, to the successful soft landing of the Chandrayaan-3. It is in this context that today's talk on World Upside Down, India Recalibrates its Geopolitics by Ambassador Chinoy has been organized by CISL and SISDIS. I now request our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Bimal N. Patel, to address the gathering with his opening remarks.
Jai Hind. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ashtra University and on my own behalf, I extend a very warm welcome to Ambassador Sri Sujan Chinoy, Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Analysis. It is with great pleasure that we are inaugurating Ambassador Sri Sujan Chinoy's book, World Upside Down, India Recalibrates its Geopolitics. In an era where geopolitical dynamics are shifting, where the established balance of power is undergoing transformation, we are emerging as a formidable player in this global theater. National security is not merely physical or military security as often projected. Conceptually, it is a much more enlarged construct that has been changing dynamically for almost 230 years when the US government decided to stretch beyond the foremost element of national security, military security, as the primary intent of governance. According to our own Dr. Prabhakar Paleli, the chief mentor of the School on Integrated Coastal and Maritime Security, the concept of national security has evolved into 16 mutually inclusive and interactive elements that the government has to execute by integration over the land, the home ground of nations, and over another severe terrains, physical and non-physical, in a terrain-specific governance by national security, the famous concept of GBNS. Let's first take a moment to understand the canvas on which this geopolitical drama is unfolding. The US, China, the European Union have long dominated the landscape, dictating the contours of international relations. However, as we observe this ever evolving chessboard, witness a recalibration of influence, a reordering of power, and it's here that we are stepping into the limelight. What's driving this element and seismic shift? It's a convergence of key factors. India's sustained economic growth, its augmentation of scientific and technological progress, and the demographic dividend it enjoys. These are the key ingredients for any nation to exert the weight, the influence, and the power in shaping international affairs. The Indian government's meticulous economic strategy, which is focused on innovation, research, and development, has positioned India as a hub for cutting-edge advancement. Initiatives like Make in India and Digital India have not only spurred economic growth, but also propelled us into the center stage of the global tech revolution. Furthermore, we are playing also and giving focus to boost defense industries at home, developing, for example, Rafale fighter jets, air defense systems, indigenous missile systems, BrahMos and Agnis, Indian fleet support ships and other strategic vessels, Steel class, Destroyer class, Scorpion class, aircraft carriers, etc. The boost given to the development of R&D in the country, from space programs to genomic and microbiome research. The successful Chandrayaan launch and landing, which now explore and collect data for further research. Our Mars exploration program, under which Mangalyaan was successful in its first attempt. The meticulous decision requires an insignificant amount of patience, hard work, and development of scholarship. The SARS-CoV is well just another example of our leadership into research and development to secure, prevent, and protect global citizens. The development of vaccines and being among the topmost exporters, not only to the developing countries, but even to the developing nations. But it's not just about economic strategy, it's also about statesmanship. Our diplomatic engagements have been nothing short of impressive. Our active policy aimed at enhancing regional connectivity and engagement showcase our intent to play a vital role in the Indo-Pacific region. Our neighborhood first policy underscores our commitment to fostering stability and growth in our immediate vicinity, building partnerships that go beyond mere rhetoric. In the larger geopolitical arena, our participation in the organization like the BRICS and G20 solidify our status as a consensus builder on a global scale. Our recent expansion of BRICS membership to other like-minded nations serve their interest in the geopolitical construct. Our balanced approach, fostering partnership with both Eastern and Western powers, speak volume about our commitment to multipolar world order. And let's not forget the sheer power of statesmanship, India's deft navigation of complex relationships, its capacity to bridge diverse interests, and its diplomatic acumen are setting benchmarks. The world is taking note of India's nuanced foreign policy, its ability to manage strategic partnerships with countries like US, Russia, and others, while preserving its own interests and sovereignty. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the implications of our foreign policy are profound. Our recalibration brings both challenges and opportunities. As we assume a larger role on the global stage, we must be prepared to address the responsibilities that come with it. The question of regional security, the balanced act between major powers, and the fostering of inclusive growth are just a few, but very important challenges that await our statesmanship. As we discuss world upside down, India recalibrates its geopolitics. Let us recognize that India's ascendancy is not a mere coincidence, but a result of strategic planning, economic progress, and skilled diplomacy. The canvas of global power is being repainted, and India is contributing its own vibrant strokes. In conclusion, it can be said that India is gradually but steadily becoming a shaper and central role role player in a new global order, which is multipolar, with several loose alignments serving diverse interests, cooperative and competitive. But given the firepower available, we'll find it difficult to handle prolonged conflict. We all are keen, therefore, to listen with apt attention to the defense, national security, and diplomatic scholarly erudite of Ambassador Chinoy on the subject for our mission, national security is supreme. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I now call upon Abhishek to introduce the speaker for the day.
Jai Hind, everyone present here. I am Abhishek, a student of Masters in International Relations and Security Studies from CISIL. I am here to introduce our speaker for the day for the Lawa Confab on National Security, Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy. Ambassador Chinoy is the Director General of Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. A career diplomat from 1981 to 2018, he began his diplomatic journey in Hong Kong, going on to serve as ambassador to Japan and Mexico. His background in national security issues and his experience covers East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, particularly the political security issues relating to China and India's neighborhood. Recently, while giving an endorsement for his book, World Upside Down, India Recalibrates its Geopolitics, published in July 2023 by HarperCollins, former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Kevin Rudd, had the following to say, and I quote, Sujan Chinoy has made a profound contribution to India's defense and national security community. Few have had a diplomatic career as wide as he, taking in Asia, the Gulf, Latin America, the US, and the UN, end quote. Ambassador Chinoy is also the chair of Think 20 Engagement Group for India's G20 presidency. He has also been appointed as a member of the high-powered DRDO Review Committee by Government of India. He writes regularly for newspapers and journals, besides delivering lectures on diverse subjects in India and overseas. Now I take this opportunity to invite our Honorable Speaker of the Day, Ambassador Chinoy, to share his views.
Jai Hind. Professor Bimal Patel, Professor Venkateshwaran Lokanathan, General Asit Mistry, distinguished members of the faculty, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you very much, first and foremost, for this very kind invitation to visit you at the RRU in Gandhinagar. My very first time to be here and to also engage with such a stellar group of people. I see some foreign faces also in the hall, and I think that is testimony to the very motto that we have for India's outlook towards the rest of the world and for our G20, and that is one earth, one family, one future, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This is my first visit to the RRU, but I'm not a stranger to Professor Bimal Patel and his achievements and accomplishments. And I have therefore been following with great interest not only the establishment of the RRU, but the manner in which Professor Patel has taken it to the heights that it currently occupies in the discourse on national security in the country today. So my compliments to you, Mr. Patel. And I'm absolutely sure you could not have done this without a tremendous team that he has. Many of you are present here, so I think you also deserve a very big hand. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here actually to speak about a theme, World Upside Down, India Recalibrates its Geopolitics, and by now you guessed what this title is all about. It's the title of my book, the latest publication that HarperCollins has brought out last month on international security. And I must confess that it's been doing unexpectedly well. On Amazon, it's been bestseller #1 in a number of categories. But I must say that I had an undue advantage also For this book is not just about what I think of the world today, or the manner in which it is transiting from essentially a unipolar to a bipolar to now a drift towards multipolarity. And the numerous challenges that we have seen along this journey, it's also a bird's eye view from a vantage point that I have occupied for the last 4.5 years as the Director General of India's largest think tank that deals with defense, national security, and IR. That's the Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, now known as the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. And I say this with some confidence because that perch has allowed me to look deep into policy making in Delhi, working alongside, working with people, getting feedback, and my own interactions with various people in Delhi and in the international community. And so therefore, I thought it would be a good idea to put together not only an anthology of what I had seen, experienced, and written about in the last 3.5 to 4 years, but also to add a few chapters to this book to bring into context and sharper relief some of the themes that we are dealing with on a daily basis. And the first of this is, of course, the fact that the world today is undergoing rapid transformation, the type of transformation that we have not seen before. It's a transformation that is fundamentally altering the balance of power. It's a world in flux, therefore, and a world in flux in which we have seen that there is gradual erosion of multilateralism. The multilateralism that we had put in place, the global community had put in place at the end of the Second World War, the one that was expected to ensure that great wars never took place again, that there would be a permanent paradigm and architecture for peace and security and prosperity with the founding of the United Nations, the UN Charter, the UN Security Council, and the attendant organizations or the Bretton Woods organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. These were expected to provide a kind of stability to a world that had been rocked by two great wars, the First World War and the Second World War. And we have seen that this particular order is no longer that stable. It is not able to deal with the current challenges that the global community faces, whether it is to do with the problems of climate change, climate finance, whether it is to do with the mushrooming of new technologies like artificial intelligence and the digital space, biotechnology, space-based ISR and weapons. The current structure that we have is unable to deal with it. And I say this because there is a growing trend towards greater multipolarity as the world drifts towards a multipolarity. But there is also less of multilateralism. So there is a situation in which you find that the structures that are expected to play the role of providing stability are no longer able to do this. And the global community is therefore moving increasingly towards reliance on bilateralism or plurilateralism, minilateralism, regionalism, cooperation with like-minded countries. We are seeing more of multi-alignment, issue-based alignment. So it's a world which is fractured, but not quite yet fragmented. The structures are in place, but they're not performing. And virtually every vector that we have seen in the process of globalization for the past 30 or 40 odd years is under duress. Trade, technology, finance, the movement of human resources around the world, these are under crisis, under duress, and under challenge. And we have seen that the entire world today is also increasingly challenged by the 7 Ts. I call these the 7 Ts because each of these words begins with the letter T. We have seen how in this world in flux, one of rapid change, the world is increasingly divided in all geographies, whether it is Asia, the broader expanse of the Indo-Pacific, whether it is Europe, whether it's the sort of Northeast theater, In all geographies, we have seen the world increasingly fragmented as a result of friction on trade. Now, trade is the first T, the T of trade. The second T is the T, and I'll go over these in a while because I'm speaking to a student audience primarily. The second T is that of technology. The third T is that of territorial differences and conflict. The fourth T is that of terrorism. The fifth T is that of tenets, narratives, principles, systems of social, economic, political, and cultural governance. And the sixth T is that of transparency or the lack of it. And the seventh T is that of that one fundamental factor called trust, without which the global community cannot work together to address global challenges. Now, when you look at each of these and how it divides the world today, you can see that trade has actually, in a moment of great and major power conflict and contestation, it has begun to divide the world. As a result of globalization, the entire global community was expected to benefit. But this has not been achieved. There are some countries that have benefited more than others. Some have gamed the system better. As a result, a large part of the global community has been left out of the process of globalization. And trade, therefore, is something that increasingly divides countries today. Trade is also something that's very difficult to control. Trade is fungible. Trade is something that's not run out of the Pentagon or the State Department or South Bloc. It is something that is run by the private sector, MSMEs, entrepreneurs, the structural efficiencies between competing economies. They determine the flow of imports and exports. And therefore, we have seen that despite a trend towards what we call decoupling has not been very easy. People are now talking in Europe and America of de-risking. This is because even in a a period of time where we see major power friction and contestation over trade, trade has been very difficult to control. And trade has been growing, for example, between India and China, even in the aftermath of Kalwan. Trade has been growing even as the United States and China speak of their contestation and the deep mistrust that they have. Even between Japan and China, between Australia and China, trade has grown in recent years. So the second T is that of technology. This is the T that divides the world today, is rapidly cleaving the world into two large groups, those that look to the United States and the West for the future of their technologies. And there's also a large number of countries that look to China. Technology is something, by the way, that is easier to control, relatively easier to control because it has a lot of investment that goes in on the part of either the governments around the world or very large corporations that work closely with government. And in technology, we've seen how the United States has actually used, alongside Western partners, they've used export controls and sanctions to stem the flow of high technologies that had moved unbridled from the West to China in the half century of their strategic partnership between the United States and China. That strategic partnership that was started by the visit of Henry Kissinger first and then President Nixon for that great reset in the 70s, which has lasted all of 50 years and which saw the transfer of a great deal of high technology, including the defense sector, from the United States to China. But that has come to a dead halt now as the friction and contestation unfolds over semiconductors and chips and things like that. The third T is that of territorial differences. We have seen how the global situation today is fraught with friction, conflict, because of territorial differences, whether Europe, in Ukraine, whether in the Indo-Pacific between India and China, between China and Japan in the East China Sea, over the Senkakus, between China and Taiwan, across the Taiwan Strait, between China and the Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea. The territorial differences are are really up there in terms of very high risk vectors. We have also seen how terrorism, which should be uniting the world today, is actually dividing the world. There was a time when we often said that there is considerable space for India and China to work together in the multilateral space. And apart from large issues like climate change and economic development for the global south, there used to be always this issue of terrorism on which large countries that face similar threats. India faces multiple threats from cross-border terrorism, and China too has its Achilles heel in Xinjiang. But instead of uniting us, terrorism is increasingly dividing many countries and shrinking the international space where countries like India and China can work together, or countries like the United States and China can work together. They have worked together in the past, as we have with China. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, in fact, I would say there was a decade during which the United States sought the help and cooperation of other major powers, including China, to deal with international terrorism. But today we see that a China that is supporting Pakistan on several issues, including protecting those who use Pakistan as a base, preventing their listing as global terrorists under the Al-Qaeda and Sanctions Committee at the UN. This kind of attitude and behavior on the part of China is increasingly making it impossible for India and China, or the United States and China, to work together on dealing with international terrorism. The next T, which is of tenets. Now, this has actually divided the world like never before, because for the first time in history, we have seen that there are competing models. In the past, it was always that the West had the technologies and the systems in place for economic growth and progress. But we have seen how in recent decades, over the last 40 years or so, competing ideologies, including authoritarian states and structures, have also been able to demonstrate economic growth and development. And one notable example, of course, is the People's Republic of China. And that has given rise to this battle of the narratives as to whose system is superior, whether it is the West or whether it is, the People's Republic of China, whether it is democratic, liberal, open trading order, or whether it is an authoritarian single-party system like the People's Republic of China has, that would deliver. And we have seen that through the COVID pandemic, there was this discourse unfolding before our very eyes when the People's Republic of China, for instance, claimed the superiority of its system in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. Alas, that was a short-lived claim, as we saw, as they entered a disastrous zero COVID policy. And in the aftermath of actually lifting controls over that zero COVID policy, they have further suffered the consequences of an opaque system. They have actually seen a tremendous downturn in terms of their economic growth, in terms of deflation and falling exports, rising unemployment, and obviously the yuan is also rather shaky. So we have seen how China's claims, for instance, to be practicing whole process democracy. This is something that we heard when the Communist Party of China marked its centenary in 2021, that China represents whole process democracy. That's a laughable claim, as we have seen, because if a foreign minister can disappear without any kind of trace left behind, then it's hardly a democracy, and it's certainly not whole process democracy, to say the very least. We have also seen how, amidst all this friction that's taking place, we have seen how transparency has been a casualty. It's very easy today to, in an age of digital space and web, data that's so easily available on Google, we can see what are the capacities of different countries, whether it comes to bean counting of the number of tanks that a country has, or the number of ships that a country has, but it's very difficult to read and analyze and understand motivations and intentions. And this is something that has been greatly lacking. One of the examples that I can give is that while China has undoubtedly risen as a very big economic and military power, it has also been spilling over into various other geographies, not only on its immediate periphery in East Asia, but also in South Asia. It has been spilling over into the Indian Ocean. It is a China that expects the rest of the world to adjust to its rise, to adapt to the inevitable that China today is the world's second largest economy and one of the greatest military powers, at least within the region. China is not yet a global military power, it's a global economic power. The United States is both a global economic power as well as a global military power. And the gap in that regard between the number one and number two is considerable. But it's China that expects the world to adjust to its rise, but is quite unwilling to accept or adjust itself to the relative rise of others, is something that gives rise to friction. For while China has been growing undoubtedly, it is not as if the rest of the world has been sitting idle and marking time. Others have also made tremendous progress. There was a period, for instance, when it was only China and countries of East Asia that were the fulcrum of global manufacturing, the relocation of economic engines of growth and progress. But today we have seen in the 21st century, over the last 2 decades, that a much larger region is in fact growing and prospering. And it is not just East Asia, but also Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Indian Ocean littoral, many African countries. And it is therefore very important that the People's Republic of China is able to understand the relative rise of others. Your freedom ends where my nose begins. That's the English saying. And unfortunately, it's been very difficult for China to firstly understand the extent of its own power. The transformation that has taken place in the last 30 or 40 years, it's been telescoped into a very short time frame, leaving their own policymakers perhaps inadequately equipped to understand the profound disruption that the rise of Chinese power has caused, both economic and military in the region, in terms of the influence, in terms of its presence. And that has given rise to growing friction. I must therefore also mention here the Indo-Pacific, which is covered in my book. I have been arguing for a long time that the most natural fit today for understanding the paradigms of economic growth and prosperity, the new challenges that we have in our region, that paradigm is the vision of the Indo-Pacific. For the Asia-Pacific is a term which has outlived its shelf life. And I say this with great conviction, and I present before you the case that the Asia-Pacific is a concept that arose in the aftermath of the Second World War, after 1945, when Japan rose phoenix-like from the ashes of the Second World War, and particularly in the 50s began to once again emerge as a large economic power, an export-oriented power. Its destiny was linked to that one large market across the Pacific, the United States of America. That is what allowed Japan to rise as an economic power, an export-oriented growth. Alongside, we saw in the wake of Japan, the Asian tigers also growing in a similar manner, whether it was Korea, whether it was Taiwan, whether it was Singapore, whether it was Hong Kong. They all benefited because they had access to that one great market across the Pacific in the United States of America. And we have seen how the People's Republic itself, beginning in the late 70s, accessed the same market and grew in a prolific manner. This process continued till the end of the century. Till the end of the century, when the People's Republic of China was given, in fact, permanent normal trading status by President Clinton in 1999, and it was further legislated, as a normal sort of trading relationship in the year 2000, after President Bush had come to power, and that is Bush 43. And we have seen that subsequently, while China entered the WTO in 2001 and benefited in terms of a prolific and unprecedented rise, it is not as if the rest of the world was not growing. It is precisely in the opening decade of this century that we have seen a country like India also beginning to show signs of its untapped potential. And we have seen over the last 20 years, 23 years, that India now, particularly in the last 8 to 9 years, India has also emerged as one of the world's largest economies. But there are many other success stories. In our region, Bangladesh is a success story. There are many African countries, notwithstanding the COVID-19 setback that many have suffered. 75 countries are in distress today. But the broad point I'm making is that the era of the Asia Pacific was the second half of the 20th century. This century has no place for the Asia Pacific. It has to develop on the basis of a broader vision of the Indo-Pacific. For to argue, as the Chinese do, against the Asia Pacific is to say that only East Asia has the monopolistic right to grow and prosper. Yes, of course, the Asia Pacific has China in terms of centrality. And the Indo-Pacific does not have just China in mind. It has countries like India and many others. But to deny the relevance of the Indo-Pacific is to deny a democratic setup, a more accommodating setup, to deny the existence of a geography in which the aspirations of many more countries can be met in a democratic fashion. And therefore, I think the 21st century belongs to the more democratic, more open, more inclusive, more accommodating, and more in tune with the aspirations of a much larger swathe of humanity. And that is the Indo-Pacific. I cover this also in my book. But coming back to the emerging world order, and where does India find itself in this emerging order? It is instructive to go back a little in history as well. When you look at the concept of nation states, etc., we find that in the European context, of course, the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century made an attempt to create such a structure for peace and stability after decades of war in Europe. And by the time you get to the second half of the 19th century, you see the unprecedented emergence of a united and strong Germany by 1871 under Chancellor Bismarck, for instance. And Germany began to militarize its economic power, such that by the time the 20th century opens, Germany, under the Kaiser, is engaged in a military race, a naval race with Great Britain. Great Britain that dominated the high seas with its large ships called the dreadnoughts. These were large single caliber guns that could devastate vessels at sea or onshore targets. And Germany was in a race with Great Britain. This period also coincides, for instance, with the emergence of Japan in Asia, the first time that an Asian country begins to follow in the footsteps of the West after having been opened up under the threat of naval power when Admiral Perry forced Japan to open up to trade. Japan drew its own lessons when they peered down the barrel of US guns on their frigates and gunboats. The lesson that they drew was that without technology, without having the same kind of armaments that the West has, it would be impossible for Japan to survive. And Japan too began to industrialize and go down the path of militarization eventually. The rights and wrongs of their militarization are for others to debate. For me, the key question is that at the dawn of the 20th century, the world was also in flux. It was an unstable world. Many powers had emerged competing, such that there were odd combinations also. Japan and the UK, for instance, had a military naval alliance that lasted more than 20 years. Until the mid-1920s, the UK and Japan had a naval alliance, while the British and the Germans were competing. And the First World War broke out. Mind you, the First World War broke out not because there were clear-cut divisions. Wars have a tendency to unfold sometimes gradually, along the way picking up participants. If we saw that Britain had entered the war in 1914, Italy had entered the war in 1915, and the United States of America, after the Battle of Jutland, entered the war only in 1917. And so therefore, when we extrapolate that to the current situation, I would say there is no real need for the quadrilateral security dialogue to be an alliance and treaty partnership. These things happen along the way as interests are threatened, as participants see their participation in conflict as integral to their survival. These things can happen. They've happened in the past as well. Even during the Second World War, we saw that all belligerents were not already engaged with one another on opposing sides as blocs. They gradually entered the war as their interests were threatened. That can happen again in the 21st century. But my point is about the emerging order. The First World War led to very feeble attempts to set up a stable architecture through the Treaty of Versailles, which was a failure. It was not able to meet the requirements of many countries, including the requirements of China, which found that their territory, for instance, that was under the Germans in Shantung was handed over to the Japanese, and the May 4th movement was actually a protest against their own enfeebled diplomacy in the Treaty of Versailles and the negotiations thereafter. That failure was followed by the failure of the League of Nations. In my view, when the League of Nations came about in 1920, it was almost dead on arrival because it didn't have the support of the United States of America. President Woodrow Wilson wanted the rest of the world in the likeness of US values and principles, but was not willing to commit himself to geographically to the rest of the world or to be present in various parts of the world. And due to lack of US support, the League of Nations also was unable to keep in check the frustrations of Germany and Japan that began to militarize again. So by the time you get to the 1930s, the world is again back to square one, no real stable architecture, and the Second World War takes place. But when the Second World War ends, we see that the current global order was midwife at that time. An order that is more relevant to 1945, an order in which the UN Security Council, as it is presented to us today, is a reflection of those archaic times where the victors took all the spoils, and the Republic of China in 1945 was made a member of the UN Security Council simply because they wanted one Asian country to fit in to an order that was essentially European in nature. And through a stroke of luck, these countries, none of them except the United States had nuclear weapons then. So having nuclear weapons is not really a qualification to enter the UN Security Council. That's what history tells us, because the others acquired nuclear weapons later. But the point I'm making is that that is the order that we are grappling with today. That is the order that is unable to deliver today when it comes to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, the differences, the politicization over the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen how the UN Security Council has been divided. It's not been able to work out any kind of decisions. We have seen how, over the past few years, the trade wars and the narrative wars between the United States and China, these have also had their impact and disruption on the working of the UN Security Council. We have seen how more recently that same structure has been utterly unable to deliver when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So we are looking at an international order today, which is frozen in time, which was more relevant to 1940s, which is not a true reflection of the actual change in the balance of power that has taken place. It reflects only part of the change. It reflected change to the extent that the Republic of China was thrown out in 1971, and the People's Republic of China, through a lottery ticket, was brought in and helicoptered into the UN Security Council. But as I said, the rest of the world has not been standing still. It is in this, international order that actually a country like India has done very well. It has come to be the world's fifth largest economy. It is the world's most populous country. If nuclear weapons were required as a ticket to the Security Council, well, then we do have nuclear weapons. If values and principles are required and commitment to the UN Charter, then you're not going to find a better country than India when it comes to commitment to the values of peace, security, and development that are enshrined in the UN Charter. the fact that we are committed to participating in UN peacekeeping operations around the world, and yet it is in India that is not part of this Security Council. So tinkering with this system is not going to help. Some fundamental changes are required. How those changes will come about is the moot question, because one of the things that I address in my book is that global orders are neither made nor dismantled easily. They do not come because people say good things, people speak about principles and values. These are not good enough to change a global order. Global orders change when there is a crisis, usually as a result of wars, usually as a result of cataclysmic changes. And it is from such disasters and horrendous events and occurrences that usually new global orders are born. But are we ready to countenance a fundamental cataclysmic change to the global order today? Because we live in the age of nuclear weapons. We live in an age where, it's not just the permanent members of the UN Security Council that are equipped with nuclear weapons. Many others also have access to these technologies. Some are just the turn of a screwdriver away from these technologies if threatened more. For example, Japan. So we have to look very carefully at how this world is transiting. From the Chinese point of view, I think the Chinese have realized that it is not a wise thing to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Chinese, while being the rising hegemon, while challenging the reigning hegemon, that is the United States, are actually quite keen to keep intact the existing global order to the extent that it has served their purpose. It is that same existing global order that has allowed the Chinese to become a member of the WTO, to have access to the global markets, to be a member of the UN Security Council, to sit there in an exceptional situation and use their veto over things, even to prevent countries like India to come in, whether in the NSG or whether in the UN Security Council. And yet at the same time, the Chinese have realized that when there is increasing reference to the rules-based international order, and they usually resent the use of this term, what they mean is that it is dominated by the West. So they want to have their cake and eat it too. Without essentially agreeing to change, the Chinese would also like to set up parallel alternative structures, global structures, where they can peddle their influence more. Structures like the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the new development bank of the BRICS. Now, for example, the expansion of the BRICS to bring in new members. I mean, I personally was not very clear about how Ethiopia can contribute to the BRICS agenda. But global structures are usually of that type. There is usually consensus, give and take, and expansion. The broad point I'm making is that China is riding two horses. They want to keep the existing privileged position that they have in the existing global order intact. At the same time, they want to create parallel structures that are more in their likeness and that are more conducive to their future goals and objectives. We have seen how India has always sought good relations with China. Somebody was asking me the other day, how are your relations with China? How were your relations in the past? I said, our relations with China, at least the policy part, has always been good. But is it true to say that the Chinese have a good policy vis-a-vis India? In international relations, if you want good relations, I cannot say that India has good relations with China and China has bad relations with India. The fact of the matter today is that India's policies towards China have always been positive. We have always sought good neighborly relations. We have tried to resolve our disputes and differences through dialogue, through peaceful negotiations. And this is something that history has shown throughout. But has China reciprocated in the same measure? Now, here are two countries in the existing global order that were midwifed in 1947 and 1949, respectively. And overnight, these two countries are looking for their national identities. And national identities, ladies and gentlemen, cannot be identified and secured without giving some importance to geography. So having boundaries instead of frontiers became a key aspect of nationhood. And the British had left behind lots of frontiers. And so overnight, after 1947 and 1949, there was this effort on the part of two new states, so to speak. Civilizationally, we were not new. but in terms of the current context, we were new, and both looking for boundaries instead of frontiers. The Chinese had moved in militarily in Xinjiang in 1949, in Tibet in 1950, and Pandit Nehru thought that here was a very aggressive China on our borders, as presciently warned by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel in his letter to Pandit Nehru of 7 November 1950, that for the first time in history, we now have an aggressive belligerent power on our borders. We are fond of saying that India and China have a history of coexistence that goes back to thousands of years. But mind you, it was more in a civilizational context in terms of toing and froing of people who came in search of knowledge, people like Dharmaratna and Bodhidharma and Kumarajiva and all who went to China. And then you had people like Fa Hien, that is Fa Xian, and Huansang, that is Xuanchuang, coming to India in the 7th century. But that is not being neighbors physically. There were buffer states. Tibet was always an independent state during those times. The Chinese keep changing the timelines. 42 years ago, when I used to talk to the Chinese, they said Tibet has always been part of China since the Yuan dynasty. By the way, the Yuan were themselves foreigners. They were Mongols. They were not Han. And by the way, the Qing, who followed the Ming, were also technically not Han. They were Manchus, as you know. But today, if you see the Chinese narrative, it is that Tibet has always been a part of China since the Tang dynasty. So in a matter of the 42 years that I have been in this public space, the Chinese have shifted back another 500 years. And we have seen that in the 1950s, there was trouble on our borders. Beginning around 1953, the Chinese were already probing areas in Badahoti, in the middle sector. And when the Indian delegation went to China to negotiate the Panchsheel Agreement in 1954, they were there for several months. They were expressly told to avoid discussions on the boundary question. Now, I think that was not wise policy, because that was tantamount to sweeping the key problem between India and China under the carpet, ostrich-like, in the hope that nobody will talk about it. And if the Chinese were to raise it, the Indian team was told to disengage and come back. I have seen from our historical records that any understanding that India had through Panchsheel, that the passes, the 6 passes in the middle sector that were identified, for example, for trade and pilgrimage, beginning with Shipki, Spiti, Mana, Niti, Khungri Bingri, Dharma, etc., that these were border passes. The fact of the matter is that the language of Panchsheel did not call them border passes. And although our customs and immigration and all checkposts were there, and so in international law, it is common sense that to assume that they are border passes. The Chinese denied that they were border passes later. And the 50s was an era of trouble for us, because Tibet itself was up in arms. The 17-point agreement had failed in 1951. Even earlier in 1950, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the 14th, had tried to come to India and was dissuaded from coming in. But later, after the failure of the 17-point agreement, a few years later, the Kham, rebellion had taken place, and things were literally snowballing. Our problems on the border were also multiplying. The Chinese had attacked our post at Longchu in 1959, and in October of that year, they also attacked the police party led by Havildar Karam Singh at Konkala in Ladakh, and there were about 10 casualties there as well. The police memorial, by the way, in Delhi is dedicated to first and foremost that police party. Mind you, it was the 50s when in Ladakh we had the Central Armed Police Forces looking after our border. It was brought under the army only after that attack on Konkala in 1959. And in Nefa, that is the precursor to Arunachal Pradesh, it was the Assam Rifles, and the Assam Rifles were reporting to the Ministry of External Affairs until 1964, when they were handed over to the Ministry of Home Affairs. So very complex situation, the flight to the Dalai Lama, the 1962 war, etc. And then this huge hiatus of 14 years when we are not even talking to them. And we have finally a realization only in the mid-70s that the world was changing. The world has always been changing, but not enough to accommodate everyone's interests. But the change that took place in the 70s was fundamental to our own calculations, that there was a big reset taking place between the United States and China. And Bangladesh had already been midwifed in the subcontinent. And we might have to have better relations with China. And President K.R. Narayanan, who was then Additional Secretary, Policy Planning in the Ministry of External Affairs, was sent as our ambassador when we resumed ambassadorial level ties in 1976. And then in the 80s, we had the official level talks on the boundary question, 8 rounds. I participated in many of them, did not resolve the problems. In fact, it led to Rajiv Gandhi's visit in the great hope of 2 things. One, that there was a consensus between India and China through Rajiv Gandhi's visit, that A, the vexatious boundary question will be set aside, we will continue to talk about it peacefully, etc. B, that we will improve our relations in all sectors, particularly in trade and economic relations. Both these great hopes have been dashed on the harsh, rocky terrain of Galwan in June 2020, when we realized that all the protocols and agreements that we have concluded, on many of which I have spent my life, like the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement of 1993, or the 1996 CBM's agreement, which I had the onerous task of implementing over the next 4 years as head of the expert group of diplomatic and military officials, that these were not enough to keep peace between India and China. This is because of China's unilateralism, its militarization, its very offensive, ambitious, and I should say spurious, policies with regard to its so-called line of actual control of 7 November 1959. That's the root cause of problems there. Because the word LSE is not something that is part of our lexicon. It crept into our lexicon only in the 1970s. And in the 60s and 70s, we used to always say so-called LSE. We met the Chinese LSE. We had only an international boundary. We never had a line of actual control. But beginning the mid-70s, we also began to look at the possibility of negotiations with China. And we began to look at how we should have identified our line of actual control. If the Chinese case is that we cannot claim the whole of Aksai Chin because we were never there, well, that equally applies to them. Because when they pitched their so-called line of 7 November 1959, they were nowhere near it. China's LAC has always been one that has crept up incrementally to match its political, ambitions. The one thing I would say about this is that China clarifies just enough to be able to state claims, but deliberately keeps claims imprecise enough to be able to interpret claims in any manner that suits them. So they are clear enough to be able to state claims, but deliberately imprecise enough to be able to change their positions midway through a negotiation. We have seen how such agreements and protocols, despite our best efforts, have not been able to keep peace because of an aggressive posture by China, where a routine exercise on the Tibetan plateau was converted in June and the weeks preceding that, but particularly in June 2020, to overnight deployments along the LAC, on which both sides know there are differences. And the rest is history. Why they did it is anyone's guess. I've tried to cover it in my book as well. It could be due to internal pressures. It could be due to their own suffering a lot of criticism on key issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea. Was it to send a message to us that don't come too close to the United States? Was it a message to the United States that please don't bank on India, we can easily take care of India? Was it a message to our neighbors that you should all know who is the main dominant power in Asia, and that's China? Be that as it may, I think it is the Chinese who have actually lost India. And India, that, as I said, was always seeking good relations with China, that did not harbor any kind of, ill will fundamentally towards China. And our history has demonstrated that. Successive prime ministers have spoken about it, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi has spoken many times in the past about good relations between India and China, to learn from each other, there being enough space in Asia. But if China seeks unipolarity in Asia while demanding multipolarity at the international level, then that's a very, contradictory and dichotomous position. Because what's good for the goose is equally good for the gander. China cannot say that it will demand equality, multipolarity, etc. at the international level, but in Asia would like the rest of Asia to kowtow and become part of its sphere of influence. So this is also something that I have tried to cover. I feel, to end, I feel that amidst all this, this is a new India. This is a new and confident India. This is a new and confident India led by a very strong leadership. It is led by a leadership that is not willing to compromise on sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it is a leadership which has demonstrated, its capacity to lead India into the 21st century as a major power. We have become the 5th largest economy in the world already, and in the next few years, I would say in the next 5 years, we should become the world's 3rd largest economy. It is an India that is capable of moving with the West when it comes to openness and democracy and the liberal, values, freedom of navigation, overflight, human rights. We are second to none with our democracy. And at the same time, it is an India that has now become, in fact, the voice of the global South, as we have seen during the G20 process also, of which I've had the privilege of being a part. That India today speaks for the global South, for the distressed countries that have suffered the consequences of the COVID pandemic, or the great disruptions caused in supply chains, more particularly as a result of the war in Ukraine. It is an India that is willing to give a new moral compass to the rest of the world in a global order that is rapidly changing, one that is in a state of flux, one which has not yet found its true equilibrium. It is an India that is willing to share with others as a Vishwa Guru, as a Vishwa Vaidya. Vishwa Guru in terms of our principles of peace and non-violence. Vishwa Vaidya because through our vaccine Maitri program, even at the height of the COVID pandemic, we were able to share 300 million doses of the vaccine with 101 or 102 countries, if not more. Our participation in COVIN and COVAX demonstrates this capability. We have taken a number of initiatives which are pro bono, which are good for mankind, whether it comes to the International Solar Alliance, whether it comes to the International Day of Yoga, whether it comes to the Coalition on disaster resilient infrastructure, whether it comes to infrastructure for resilient island states, whether it comes to one sun, one world, one grid. It is India that is in the forefront of these initiatives to unite mankind, humankind, to make sure that the benefits of technology, of globalization are available to the rest of the world, to make sure that these great challenges today of food, fuel, fertilizer, and finance being in deep distress, the 4 Fs are in great distress, that there is something that we can do cooperatively together as one to address these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not enough to criticize the existing global order. We cannot simply say that we want change. We cannot challenge the existing global order. What we have to seek is genuine reforms. And we have to ensure that the existing global order, without going through cataclysmic changes of the type that suggest war, destruction, and death all around, potential use of nuclear weapons, that without going through that, can we have an epiphany? Can we have a self-realization of what is good for us in the 21st century? And if that realization is something that India can bring about for the rest of the world, then this is the right time. India is making history right now with a very, very formidable combination of its human resources, its talented people, its demographic dividend, its march in technology, as we have put a lander on the moon through our moon mission, the kind of achievements that we have, combined with a very strong and determined leadership, we actually can change this world, make it a better place for all of us. Thank you very much.
I'm not sweating because I'm nervous. It's simply the warmth of your reception.
Thank you, sir, for giving a bird's-eye view of your experience in the field of national security and international relations, the importance of dealing with 70s, as highlighted by sir, trade, technology, territorial differences, terrorism, tenets of socio-economic political governance, transparency and the lack of it, and trust in order to address the global challenge, insights into the Indo-Pacific, emergence of the world order, India-China relations, and a confident India. We, as students and researchers of Rashtriya University, shall strive hard to further the research in these areas. Thank you, sir. The floor is now open for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and keep the questions short and crisp. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Chetna. First of all, thank you for this insightful session. My question is that, as you told that China is a rising hegemonic power in today's world order, I want to ask that specifically how it is going to impact India on various international forums like BRICS, SCO, and G20, etc.
That was unavoidable. No, that's a good question. I think one of the biggest disruptions in the global order has been the rise of China. And the consequences must be felt as we look around because fundamentally due to the fact that China is a very different country. Its values are very different. Its political structure, its social, economic, and cultural systems, its history is very different. And it cannot be more different as compared to ours. This is something that I've tried to cover in my book as well. Because when you look at our histories, we both appear to be large agrarian populous countries with some shared values also in terms of what I should say is the pantheon of Hindu Buddhist thought and philosophy that we gave to China, as in Buddhism and the whole panoply of associated values went from India to China, not the other way around. I mean, I do agree we got lychees and fishing net technology for Kerala, just Kerala, from the Chinese, maybe some porcelain and some tea. But when you look at the fundamentals of philosophy, you look at the impact of Kalaripayattu, yoga, pranayama, all this on Chinese practices, you will see the similarity and the deep impression that was made by the earliest of our travelers that went there. Our differences are also related to how we were midwifed into existence. The People's Republic of China came about as a result of tremendous bloodshed, civil war during the first part of the 20th century. India's journey was exactly the opposite. As we were trying to shed colonialism, we were all about ahimsa, satyagraha, peace, non-violence. For Mao, it was that power flows from the barrel of a gun. Mao had said very early on, in 1927, that power flows from the barrel of a gun. And President Xi Jinping has also said it quite recently, in recent years, that power flows out of the barrel of a gun. That the PLA, is the sort of sword arm of the party, etc. So our experiences also make us very different societies. How we behave in international fora is also therefore very different. India is there to try and contribute to the global good, to try and look at how the interests of the global south can be met, etc. And I think the People's Republic is there in these fora essentially for itself. Today, it's reached a stage where they themselves are asking many people, including us, in India whether China is a member of the Global South or not. Well, it's certainly not a member of the G7, but the G7 are not able to accept China within their fold as a G8 like Russia was between, say, 1998 and 2014 till it went into Crimea. The Russians were also part of this grouping, but China has never been part of it. And the global south will find it very difficult to accommodate China because China has a GDP of 19 plus trillion dollars and a per capita GDP of $12,000. So whether it is the G20, whether it is SCO, whether it is the BRICS, our profiles are very different. India stands for the global south, of course for its own interest also, but as a bridge also between the developed countries and the developing countries. China stands for itself, creating a sphere of influence, growing in terms of camp followers in many structures so that they're able to deal better with the West when it comes to major power contestation. The approach to these things is very different. I have no doubt in my mind that when the Chinese look at expansion of the SCO or that of BRICS, it's a very different mindset. It is to also bring in countries that can vote with them in Geneva against any human rights resolutions that are tabled by the West, etc. So, how will India and China work together? Well, one can say that as two, obviously now neighboring countries since 1949 and 1950, we really should be working together on the larger issues like climate change. But in recent years, the Chinese economy has grown, its level of industrialization has grown, its programs with regard to solar or renewables, particularly battery technologies, EVs, etc., is of a different order, and they now deal with this subject on their own vis-a-vis global standards and the West. So that link with India and the developing countries in climate change, etc., is no longer what it was earlier. As I said, when it comes to terrorism, we should be working together. But that space has shrunk because if they attach greater importance to saving Pakistan's skin as compared to the logical listing of global terrorists at the United Nations, terrorists from the JEM and the LET, then how do you work together? Notwithstanding the fact that they have a problem in Xinjiang, they will suffer the consequences of a blowback from the AFPAC areas, and they are suffering the consequences of their unbridled ambitions also in Pakistan, in Balochistan particularly, and in Afghanistan. You time and again see how they are attacked. Chinese engineers and Chinese technicians in these remote parts. So I feel the international space for us to work together has also shrunk. On human rights and things like that, the less said, the better. I mean, how do we work on human rights and principles in a country where a foreign minister can disappear? So we have to find a new modus vivendi to work with China. We will have to coexist. I think the better way to coexist is through a peaceful, relationship. Even if we don't integrate so much, we have to learn to respect each other. So mutual respect is very important. And for that, what I'm leaving with you is this thought that it's not just India that should have a good policy towards China. India cannot have a good policy towards China when China has a bad policy towards India, as is the case. We have to ensure that China also has a good policy towards India.
Sir, my name is Savni Upadhyay and I'm currently pursuing my bachelor's in defense and strategic studies and I'm in my second year. Third, and rightly said by you that we are slowly drifting towards multipolarity, and which means that we'll have more stakeholders in the international arena. And regionalizing terrorism can be considered as a consequence of this fragmentation or the structure. So what, according to you, firstly, if you could help us have a peek in the future, what does the future look like in this sphere? And secondly, what are the amendments and changes that the international bodies should undertake to ensure and aid stability and unity amongst nations?
So firstly, I'm no soothsayer or crystal ball gazer, and in this world which is so rapidly changing, it's very difficult to predict the future. People used to talk about a kind of midterm peak as 5 years. Today, 5 years is like a lifetime, you know. So if you are right, even over the next year, you can take credit for it, you know. That is the pace at which things are changing around the world. And there are 3 or 4 things that stand out for me. One is that India is destined to rise, and that we will continue to grow at our own pace and be right there at the top by the time we get to the middle of this century. When it comes to the United States of America, I would say that the US has an uncanny, unbelievable, phenomenal capacity to reinvent itself. It is still the world's largest economy. It is still the world's largest and most potent military, with a footprint in every part of the world. And of late, it has realized that it had been sleeping at the wheel. It had dropped the ball and has refocused its attention on taking manufacturing back to the United States in obviously a cost-efficient manner, not a self-defeating manner. But the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, the Science Act, the CHIPS Act, the kind of funding that it is putting behind all this now, you read these figures, they're $50 billion, $60 billion. It is reinventing itself. And as I told you, that the second P of technology has been better controlled through export controls and sanctions. And there is a regime of denial. And this is not just cussedness. It is not just simply to contain China. It is also to ensure that US technologies on which America has spent billions of dollars on R&D, etc., is not simply siphoned off one way or the other by the People's Republic of China. And I think that's a fair assessment that they have finally made. So the US will continue to grow. It is not necessary for the US to be the world's largest economy in order to be the world's most potent power. With a GDP per capita which will remain at least 5-6 times that of the per capita GDP in China, the US will always remain, miles ahead, even if China were to, in nominal terms, overtake the Chinese economy. This logic, of course, applies to us also. It's like saying that if we overtake Great Britain as an economy, it doesn't mean that our per capita standards match that of a British household, but that will equally apply to China. China is also growing rapidly. It is likely to age before it becomes genuinely rich. And they are caught in a middle income trap also right now with the denial regimes around them. Rightly so, because people have woken up to the enormous theft also that was taking place. The US has done a number of studies to see what percentage of their technologies have actually been stolen and what kind of role China played in this. And China takes first prize for all that. Now, China will not be able to realize its China dream by 2049 if there is no unification with Taiwan. Is there anyone in this room who can tell me that any Chinese leader can stand on the rostrum at Tiananmen in 2049 and declare, like Mao had declared in 1949, can someone declare that the Chinese dream has been achieved and that the Chinese nation stands rejuvenated if Taiwan is not back in the fold? My answer would be no. That means that something has to give between now and 2049. Whether that is peaceful unification or whether it is a forced takeover by China is moot question. Whether the Chinese would be unwise enough to attempt a forced takeover is also a moot question, because under the circumstances, it can only derail China's own trajectory, which is also an upward trajectory, but an upward trajectory with which great uncertainty is attached, simply because it's not a democracy, simply because there is no succession plan, simply because foreign ministers can disappear without a trace. Then you cannot be speaking very confidently about their industry and their statistics and their
so-called figures that they give you about growth and development. And it is a country which has recently passed draconian laws to prevent the private sector and the public sector from sharing information on website. Even the most anodyne of statistics now cannot be shared by Chinese companies for the outside world to make an assessment of the Chinese economy. If this is the situation, I would say, would you like to place long-term bets on the stability of the Chinese system? I wouldn't put my money there. I would put it on an open system where warts and all in our system, we are predictable, because everything is there to see, to be able to assess. So with these trends, India's rise, inevitable and a given, US domination continuing well into the 21st century, China growing but full of contradictions and uncertainties, particularly in our part of the world with regard to Taiwan. This will make for interesting times. As the Chinese, curse goes, may you live in interesting times.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Sanjay Kumar Dixit. Sir, India has always took its own stand during any global crisis. But this time, India has always took its own stand during any global crisis. But this time, when Ukraine-Russia war happened, India took its neutral stand. But the West and our own journalists marked it as a global shift. So why is it happening, sir? And as a diplomat, what are your views on this?
Look, my view is that India has always taken its own decisions, and it took its own decision and view. It had its own assessment of the war in Ukraine. The fact of the matter is that the war in Ukraine is a disaster, but it is not for the first time that the world is facing such a disaster. In our theater, in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific also, there have been many challenges in the past, and even currently we are facing the challenge of major disruption as a result of the unilateral activities, militaristic activities of China. So for the West or for certain journalists in India to say that it's a shame that India has not supported the West on Ukraine, as far as that is concerned, I'd say that is really begging the key question that is India supposed to take sides because the West suddenly decides to criticize Russia? You take a look at Germany. Germany, until a few years ago, was in fact one of Russia's closest friends in Europe. Political friends in terms of economic partnership, etc. Just a few years ago, when President Trump came to power in January of 2017, there was a lot of buzz at that stage of a possible reset with Russia, between the United States and Russia, a possible reset which was put paid to because of the Mullen investigations and alleged interference by the Russians in the political processes in the United States. So when we look at this, we have to also keep in mind the background to the war in Ukraine. I would say Ukraine was not a black swan event. It was a grey rhino event. Everyone knew it was coming along. When, for example, the 21st century unfolded and we saw the crisis taking place in terms of Russia's relations with Georgia, Russia's views with regard to Moldova or with regard to, particularly Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we knew what the Russian view was. The great disappointment that Russia had been speaking about with regard to expansion of NATO, some of the promises that had been made by the West that NATO will not expand, and yet there was obviously an increase in terms of the spread and numbers of NATO. So the writing was on the wall that sooner or later the Russians are going to take seriously what they've been saying all along. I mean, Putin had been saying this to, President Clinton, to Mrs. Clinton when she was secretary. He had been saying this to Obama and others that for them, their view was that Ukraine is not a state. The Russian view, this is not my view, please don't misunderstand me. The Russians had a view that Ukraine is not a state. It is part Central European, it is part East European, and then it is part Russian and things like that. And Crimea was a red flag also. When what was his name, Viktor Lukashenko, was removed, whatever he was. The point is that it was seen by the Russians as some kind of a red line that had been crossed. Well, from our point of view, we are not concerned with this. Our point is that we have to take an objective view of our own relations with Russia as well. For many decades in the past, the Soviet Union and the successor legacy state of Russia has stood by India in the UN Security Council on key and core issues of concern to us, including Kashmir. Russia is also, like the Soviet Union, the key provider of many defense platforms to India. And that legacy goes back to the early 60s, when we concluded one of the first agreements was with regard to, for instance, manufacturing the MiG aircraft, the 21, in India. This happened at a time when the West was not willing to give us these technologies. So there was a history of our relations with Russia, whether in defense, whether as an export market for some of our rice and tea, and also our relationship in the field of energy, our investments in Sakhalin, their takeover of the SR refinery in Gujarat, for instance. We cannot simply trash all this and say, because the West has taken overnight a view to regard Russia in demonic terms, so India must likewise be a camp follower and immediately say the same thing. Today they are all hoisted on their own petard. The war is still going on. A year and 6 months later, the coffers of the European countries are being rapidly depleted. They are heading for definitely bad times when it comes to their energy security, their livelihoods, standards of living, etc. This because they're expending billions of dollars a day on bombing each other. I think the war should stop. That is why the Prime Minister said now is not the era of war. There is no problem on earth which has to be sorted out through war. Whatever the rights and wrongs, at the end of the day, you will have to sit across the table and ask us. We have lived as a country with adverse possession of our territory for the past 7 decades. In the case of POK, in the case of the Trans-Karakoram tract of Shaksdam, which the Pakistanis handed over in 1963 to China. We have lived with adverse possession of our territory in Aksai Chin since 1962. And yet we have been amenable and open to dialogue and peaceful resolution of our differences with China. So that kind of common sense should prevail.
Thank you, sir. Announcement to the audience. Ambassador's book has been put up for display. Students and faculty members who are interested in buying the book will be getting a signed copy from the ambassador at a discounted price. Thank you. I now call upon Director, School of International Cooperation, Security and Strategic Languages to deliver the concluding remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I was hoping my senior colleague, General Mistry, the director of SysDis, would do this, because I think being Sir's schoolmate, this would have been for
Rival. He was in the rival school.
He was okay, rival school.
I was at the Rajkumar College.
So it would have been appropriate for Sir to actually have this opportunity. He's always been magnanimous and he's given me this opportunity. I think before we begin, I request our Vice Chancellor, Sir, to give away the memento to our guest of the day, Ambassador Chinoy. Somebody could just give us the memento. And of course, the shawl is a mark of respect. Big round of applause. and Ambassador Chinoy mentioned this, is largely whatever he said was directed towards the students. There's plenty of food for thought in that sense, that he has covered a broad area of, sort of huge sweep of whatever has been happening, from the fact that India is a rule-shaping, emerging influence with a very solid value system, or what he himself said as a new moral compass. The 7 T's that he has identified, I think there are plenty of questions for each and every student to actually do more research on and generate, more and add to the existing discourse. Ambassador Chinoy, very, very happy to inform you that other than the students of international relations and defense and strategic studies who are the hosts for the day, we have actually a diverse crowd here of students and faculty from criminology, from forensic studies background, from law background, from coastal security and maritime. And the 7 T's actually are largely focused on a number of these issues. For example, he mentioned about trade. How do we deal with the trade imbalance with China, for example, is a very significant issue. Do we leverage on it, or do we try and address and ensure that the trade imbalance is negated? He spoke about technology, for example, the 5G challenge that we have. How do we deal with artificial intelligence and its influence on employment, access to high technology, the emerging as a very strong manufacturing base for technology, territorial differences, as Galwan and Doklam have shown. How do we deal with those challenges? He spoke about tenets and narratives, for example, and how do we, strengthen democratic credentials plus rule of law. Sir also spoke on transparency and trust, which again is so very important as one of the populous countries in the world. Having representation in the UNSC as a member would become an extremely important component of what we would see as effective governance for some of the challenges that is currently coming up. Sir called for genuine reforms, which is an extremely important area that I think a lot of students should start focusing on. And he also spoke on terrorism. How do we deal with the asymmetric challenges posed by our neighbor? Sir briefly referred to POK in that context. Ambassador Chinoy, I take the liberty to, make some personal anecdotes, sir. If we had gone down to actually talking about Ambassador Chinoy's achievements, it would have taken a better part of an hour if we had actually introduced him. So we missed out on a number of things that Ambassador Chinoy has done in his professional capacity. And one of them was, of course, his tenure as the National Security Council Secretariat. I had the distinct privilege of going and serving at the NSCS for 7 years. And a better part of my initial years, Ambassador Saurabh Kumar, who is the current Secretary, was the Joint Secretary. And he took a liking to me and decided that I'm going to do something on China, which I thought was at that point of time an extremely difficult task. So when I spoke to a number of my seniors there, including Akshay Joshi sir, as well as Bashim Kasuri, a number of them told me that the best way you can do, and Ambassador Saurabh Kumar made it very clear, you are reading for the next 6 months. He gave me 10 books, and I had to do a lot of internal readings. And they told me to read a lot of the notes that you had put down there. So my understanding on China over the last 10 years has been actually shaped by a lot of things that Ambassador Chinoy has actually very, very aptly observed in some of those internal notings. And I consider that a privilege, sir. And I really thank you for all the work that you've done in terms of how do we deal with this challenge. On behalf of course, the university and the Vice Chancellor, sir, as well as the host for the day, which is the School of International Cooperation, Security and Strategic Languages, and the School of Defense and Strategic Studies, I take this opportunity to thank you for taking time out, sir, and being here physically. Most of our lectures happen online, but the fact that you were here and you promptly said that I'd like to come there, and straight out of the flight, sir, has a meeting in the afternoon today, But just as he got off, he's rushed here, and very kind of you, sir, because I know that we've got the next generation of, I would say, a cadre of strategic warriors who are here, and it would be nothing better than listening to somebody in person. And hopefully, all the things that sir has shared here today for almost an hour would trigger the thought process, and all of you will be able to actually build on this and start working on this and contribute to strengthening India's national security and foreign policy. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our Vice Chancellor, sir, because as my student, the MC, mentioned, we've done this is the 36th lecture in about 22 months. And we wouldn't have been able to cover all of this without the positive support that we always receive from the Vice Chancellor, sir. In fact, thanks to Ambassador Chinoy, because the last time I remember Vice Chancellor sir attending our lectures was the 3 back-to-back lectures that we did. So it took us 3 experts to bring Vice Chancellor sir from his very, very hectic schedule to attend. And then finally, of course, you've now got sir to attend also. So we're very thankful to you in that sense. And of course, sir, you're well known. To the students, I really hope you've taken down copious notes. If you needed a clue, all you had to do was look at what Vice Chancellor sir was doing. He was taking down notes in rapid pace, and so did I. And I think I hope you'll all go and revise and revisit some of the things that's been said. Once again, sir, thank you very much, Ambassador Chinoy, as well as the Vice Chancellor. I also thank General Mistry and the School of Internal Security, Defense and Strategic Studies for hosting this, because I remember the idea of the Lavad Confab, so Lavad is where we are hosted, came from a conversation that I had with Professor Patel in terms of trying to put together a platform where we could bring people together. So in that sense, the fact that we have students across disciplines and the fact that we've been able to do this as a joint collaboration really is a testament to what we've attempted to do in the last 2 years. So I'd like to thank all the students who came here, even from different disciplines, because a strategic bent of mind is extremely important, even as you specialize on your core areas. So please take all of this away and try and develop this even as you start looking at your specific disciplines. I thank my colleagues at CISL who've done tremendous work behind the scenes, putting all this together. Our administrative office who's sitting here, who's actually been going into each and every minute details to ensure that everything's gone smoothly. They're just organizing lunch even as we speak. I request each and every one of you, this is a fantastic opportunity to pick up a copy of Ambassador Chinoy's book. The HarperCollins has been, the local publisher has been very kind to actually reduce the rates from what's the market price. And if any of the students or any of the faculty want to buy, Ambassador Chinoy is going to sign that copy for you. And I think that will be a fantastic piece to keep for yourself. Once again, thank you very much to the entire audience and to both the schools that have organized this, Dr. Paleri. And I'd like to... So I think, Master Chinoy, we have a book that you'd like to hand over, I believe, to the Vice Chancellor. So if you could just have the book. Sure. So thank you once again, and over to you, Viva. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now request the audience to stand up and take standing ovation. Request the audience to be seated.